shots were fired, Europe led the way in everything. In 1945, when the guns fell silent, the world was bankrupt and exhausted. Across 3 decades in which empires crumbled, new players with new ideologies emerged. A world centuries in the making had been dismantled by a world war. The war was done. They called it the war to end war. The years following the armistice of 1918 would come to be known as the interwar period, the time between the end of one war and the start of another. Was it really over?
I think we need to do away with the whole idea of an interwar period from 1918 to 1939. There was a great deal of violence, much of it surrounding imperial collapse and imperial expansion and imperial reordering.
It is a period of huge instability. You also have new ideologies. Communism in the Soviet Union, fascism and Nazism in Italy and Germany. Across Europe, democracies are going to be tempted by new forms of political regimes.
The train that carried US President Woodrow Wilson to Paris was cheered all the way. His welcome to the French capital was near hysterical, as though some said it was the second coming. Of his formula for peace, his 14 points, miracles were expected. It was Wilson's statement of principles for peace that was to be used in negotiations and to ensure the world would not come to war again. But for some, these principles were fatally flawed.
Woodrow Wilson, in his 14 points, published in January 1918, coined this very dangerous idea of self-determination. I believe himself later admitted that he kind of mentioned this without knowing there's so many nations in the world.
On January 18, 1919, the peace conference opened at Versailles in a hall of mirrors. Alongside the sometimes fierce deliberations of the world leaders present, there was the work of 52 commissions and committees concerned with military, financial, and territorial issues. The recommendations of those deliberations would form a controversial treaty. Colonel T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, in Versailles with the Arab delegation, wrote, "When the new world dawned, the old men came out again and took our victory." The old men were Wilson with his 14 points, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, whose qualifications for map-making included once admitting, "Who are the Slovaks? I can't seem to place them." And his French counterpart, Georges Clemenceau, who felt the weight of more than 1 million men lost in battle. "They have claims upon us all," he said, and he wanted Germany to pay.
The Germans came to Versailles and they compared Wilson's 14 points with what they had to sign there. and they pointed out the massive differences, and they felt betrayed.
The demand issuing from Versailles that has been most vilified by history is reparations.
And this was justified by Clause 231, the famous war guilt clause, which laid all responsibility for the war at the feet of Germany.
If war guilt was the issue that made the loudest noise in Germany, the issue that most taxed the commissions and committees at work on the settlement was the map of the world.
Versailles in 1919 was a moment when nationalist hopes flared up, encouraged by Wilson's rhetoric about the importance of listening to colonized peoples.
The great powers faced endless petitioning by national, ethnic, religious and language groups, who pressed their claims with questionable statistics and misleading, if not blatantly fraudulent maps.
All the politicians from these newly established countries sent people to libraries, start looking for maps from the time when they had the largest possible territory to make a historical claim on the territory.
What were these newly established countries? They were mostly the successors to the Habsburg Empire, which for centuries had colored a broad band that bisected Europe.
The consequences of the First World War were truly devastating for the Habsburg Empire, which disintegrated even before any treaties were signed.
What happened after the collapse of this multi-ethnic empire was the creation of several smaller political units which very much resembled the monarchy in the diversity of the population. So not much actually changed.
So Czechs, Slovaks, Romanians, Ruthenians, Croats, Serbs, and so on all declared their independence.
Amongst the states the peacemakers created were neighbors that flanked Germany, supposedly to check any future German aggression. But they were lesser nations, incapable of independently defending themselves. A row of skittles for a resurgent Reich.
This peace left the Germans still relatively strong potentially, this is very often stated, even if in the moment they were terribly weakened by all these conditions and payments and restrictions, but still Germany remained pretty much the same.
The actual reparations payments as they were settled amounted to around about 2 billion marks per year, which was a burden that Germany certainly could shoulder.
No one doubted that the Reich would recover. The danger was that recovery would be stained by feelings of vengeance.
After the end of the First World War, there is in Germany a widespread feeling that we could have almost won this war. It was only because we were stabbed in the back.
It was pretty deliberately fabricated by the military high command, especially by the two major military commanders of the last couple of years of the war, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his Assistant General Erich Ludendorff.
General Ludendorff, staying at Berlin's five-star Adlon Hotel, bumped into a member of the Allied Disarmament Commission, also billeted there. Ludendorff expressed to British General Neil Malcolm the opinion that the German army had not been defeated, but betrayed by forces at home. Not defeated, Malcolm queried. You mean they were stabbed in the back? And so it was that one of the most persistent and pernicious of interwar myths was inadvertently fathered by a British general.
Now, this story was false from beginning to end, and they knew this perfectly well, but they also knew that this lie would be both something that would help their reputations and would help them to rebuild a kind of right-wing nationalist, militaristic political movement in the years that followed the war.
Perhaps remarkably, the revolution that threatened to erupt in Germany never managed to bring down the fledgling republic. The first elections resulted in success for a group of moderate parties, endorsing the leadership of Friedrich Ebert.
Ebert served the Republic well. He tried to defeat separatist tendencies in various regions of Germany, and he upheld the law and worked loyally and faithfully with chancellors and governments belonging to different political parties.
The challenge for Ebert was the legacy of bitterness that made the First War, for too many, into unfinished business. A bitterness that allowed his opponents to brand him and those who signed the armistice the November traitors. Excluded from the Paris Peace Conference was the successor state to an ally who had done so much at such cost for the Allied cause in the war's early years. President Wilson's press secretary at Versailles, Ray Stannard Baker, said, "Paris cannot be understood without Moscow. Russia played a more vital part at Paris than Prussia."
They were frightened of the implications of Bolshevik success, of the possibilities of internationalism and of world revolution.
Not all who attended on the winner's side would leave Paris content with the outcome. The Japanese delegation had high expectations going into the negotiations.
Japan played an integral role during the Paris Peace Conference. It was one of the Big Five, alongside the Americans, the British, the French, and the Italians.
It was a very heady moment to come in the matter of 50 years from a country that had suffered under unequal treaties to now entering the ranks of the great powers as the single non-Western great power.
These celebrations would quickly sour when an attempt to include a racial equality clause as an amendment to the treaty was rejected.
Ultimately, that racial equality clause did not see the light of day. It fell at the instigation of Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes, who received support from US President Woodrow Wilson. The Emperor himself made a comment to a bunch of his courtiers, speaking through the origins of World War II, and he made very clear that it was precisely this, the Allies' refusal to include a racial equality clause, set Japan off on a particular path that led ultimately through to World War II.
Although denied their racial equality clause, Japan didn't leave Versailles empty-handed. They were granted the transfer of ownership of Germany's possession of Shandong, a move that set off a wave of protest in China.
Well, the Chinese reaction to Versailles was one of really national outrage. So when the Versailles settlement came in, 3,000 Chinese students from the university across Beijing gathered in Tiananmen Square to protest the settlement, which was the handing over of German territories in China to Japan. The victorious Western powers was seen as a disappointment because of the settlement. So here people turned to anarchism, Marxism, and particularly, they started to look towards developments across the world, like the Russian Revolution. And from there, the Chinese Communist Party would emerge.
Italy also left Versailles under a storm cloud. Prime Minister Orlando stormed out, returning to Rome and a hero's welcome.
Italian interests were definitely not satisfied by the outcomes of the Paris Peace Conference. Very famously, the premier Italian poet and novelist Gabriele D'Annunzio called it a mutilated victory. One of the major problems was the fact that Italy's allies of France and Britain did not believe that Italy had made an important enough contribution for it to warrant achieving all of its objectives that had been laid out in the Treaty of London of 1915.
Groups of street-fighting fasci sprung up. One, the Fasci di Combattimento, was founded by journalist Benito Mussolini.
One of the things that's very important and that Mussolini would really try and exploit during this post-war period is the memory of the First World War. The fascists interpret the war in a very unitary key. The war for the fascists was a glorious sacrifice and was a moment of national unification and national pride.
Mussolini made his tilt at political office in the 1919 general elections.
In the general elections of November 1919, the fascist movement was stunningly unsuccessful in its aims. It achieved only fewer than 5,000 votes in Milan out of more than 200,000 cast.
Like Hitler in 1923, Mussolini's first foray into politics was a humiliating failure. Both men proved to be resilient. Negotiating peace also meant redrawing the map, or rather, redistributing it. And what to do with former parts of the Ottoman Empire, which, like the Habsburgs, had crumbled in defeat, was also high on the peacemakers' agenda. The compromise was to define the newly shared-out territories as mandates.
The mandate system that was put into place in the former Ottoman lands, in Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, amounted to a form of colonial rule, albeit with some limited constraints by Britain and France. The mandates were seen rightly as a form of European colonialism, and from the beginning they encountered fierce resistance from nationalists, for example, Syrian nationalists, who felt that the mandates were simply European imperial government.
So who would oversee this reconfiguring of the globe? US President Wilson had gone to Paris with his 14 points, the last of which stated, "A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike."
The League of Nations was the great institutional embodiment of this aim, to somehow create a forum where states could resolve their differences in peaceful and diplomatic ways rather than violent military ways. It was, some people say, a utopian or unrealistic dream. And in fact, so many of Wilson's own countrymen concluded that it was an unrealistic dream, that they refused to ratify the Covenant of the League of Nations, and the United States was conspicuously absent from the League of Nations once it was formed, even though it originated as the brainchild of the American president.
Perhaps if the League of Nations had spoken with the voices of all the great powers, things would have been different. But that was not to be.
Probably in the long run, it would not have made much of a difference. Not have made much of a difference in terms of the League's capacity to contain all the forces that eventually disrupted the international environment in the 1920s and 30s.
The Covenant of the League of Nations was eventually ratified by 42 countries in the spirit of international cooperation. But peacemaking was a fragile, messy business that was fraught from the start. The Spa Conference, held in July, agreed on the distribution of reparations for which Germany was liable. France, 52%. Britain and the Empire, 22%. Italy, 9.3%. Belgium, 8%. Yugoslavia, 5.9%. And 3% for the rest. it remained to agree on the total liability. But could Germany pay?
The city dwellers were facing malnutrition and shortages of food also into the post-war period. So they were going to the villages, to the countryside, trying to extract food to barter, or they were stealing it from the fields. So this divide between city dwellers and the village folk is one of the key cleavages in society during the early years of the Weimar Republic.
In Munich, the German Workers' Party took a new name. Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiter. Nazi, as it would come to be called. Its star attraction was Adolf Hitler.
Now, initially, there's no evidence that Hitler set out to immediately become the leader of the party. That wasn't the role he initially envisioned for himself. Initially, he envisioned himself being what he would call a drummer for the party. So he would use his drum, which was his voice.
People who saw him speak often described it that when he started speaking, he would be a little bit halting and hesitant. He'd be sort of finding his way and trying to sense where the crowd was. And by the end, men would jump up on tables and cheer, and women sometimes would faint in ecstasy at these words. So he really could be an incredibly effective mobilizer of crowds.
The Germany to which he spoke had had 9/10 of her merchant fleet, all of her colonies, her main sources of coal, zinc, potash, and iron ore, 15% of her wheat crop, 18% of potato cultivation, and all capital held abroad stripped from her by a settlement that was supposed to bring peace. A settlement that was supposed to organize a new and better world. But the world, it seemed, didn't work that way. In Russia, the Bolshevik regime gained little respite after the First World War, striving for survival in a violent civil war between 1918 and 1922 that affected millions.
The data for this is chilling. Between 8 and 10 million people died during the Russian Civil War. Between 1 and 2 million were killed in combat. Around 5 million died of famine. The economy collapsed. The sown area collapsed. Food production in Russia by 1921 was about a third of its pre-war level. Russia was a shell of its former self by 1921. So the cities were emptied. Moscow and Petrograd both halved in population because people had to leave the cities because they couldn't eat.
As Lenin found out when he suppressed peasant unrest, bullets do not fertilize the soil, and terror does not make the wheat grow. In March, the new economic policy, the NEP, proved, if nothing else, that Lenin was pragmatic enough to learn from his mistakes. A partial market economy was introduced.
The new economic policy doesn't emerge fully formed. It's not something that they dreamt up in detail after the Civil War. It starts with the end of grain requisitioning. So they know that the peasants are on the verge of rebellion, and they're fed up with that, and the Bolsheviks are too weak to face the consequences of a peasant rebellion.
After the May 15, 1921 election in Italy, the first fascists entered parliament. initially working with Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti to reduce support for socialist parties.
Mussolini and his allies succeed in gaining 36 seats in parliament at this time, but very quickly also say they're actually not interested in working with Giovanni Giolitti and his broad coalition, but they have been given this first foothold into parliamentary politics, which they will then use and exploit over the next year or so in order to take power.
On July 29, 1921, Hitler took over leadership of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and he set course towards an unimaginable cataclysm.
And on top of that, he was determined that the Nazi Party, which was very small, not be taken over or subsumed by any larger far-right party or into any broad coalition of far-right parties. He was determined that it would maintain a very distinctive, separate profile.
It makes no difference whether they laugh at us or revile us, Hitler said. The main thing is that they mention us.
We see the rise of nationalism as the main source of political legitimacy, alongside communism in the Soviet Union. But in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, in Germany, it is nationalism.
The Great War was unfinished business. It had clearly not built a land fit for heroes. And anger was being expressed on the streets by impromptu armies in colored shirts, black and brown. (1922) was the year that Mussolini took power, the first of the dictators. He would remain in power for 21 years.
There's a debate within the scholarship on Italian fascism about the extent to which the regime was one that was underpinned by consent of the masses to the regime or coercion. Ultimately, it's a bit of both. But everything that fascism does is underpinned by coercion and by violence.
He did not take power by leading a revolutionary march on Rome. History and King Victor Emmanuel were misinformed. He arrived by train, sporting a black shirt, black trousers, and bowler hat. He was 39 years old.
So this march on Rome and this threatened assumption of power by force, in fact, was a bluff by Mussolini. And the fascist squads that were amassing outside of Rome could easily have been taken on by the Italian army, who were still loyal to the state and loyal to the king. However, the king does not call Mussolini's bluff, and then he invites Mussolini to actually form a coalition government and to be at the head of this coalition government.
On October 31st, 1922, Mussolini was appointed prime minister, taking Italy in new political directions. At the beginning of 1923, the burden of reparation payments for Germany was reaching a crisis point.
And by January 1923, the German government came to the conclusion it simply could not meet the enormous burden of paying reparations.
On January 9th, the Reparation Commission agreed that Germany was in default for failing to deliver an in-kind reparations payment, which was a trigger for French reoccupation of the Ruhr, a military operation that had every appearance of the invasion postponed in 1918.
In response, the workers in the Ruhrland went on strike, and the German government said, "We will continue to pay your wages, but not having the income from taxation or from the Ruhrland, for example, they were forced to print money in order to make these payments. And this led to rampant exponential inflation.
Hyperinflation reached its peak in November, when the mark's value fell below 4 trillion to the dollar. A kilo of rye bread cost 163 marks in January 1923. By November, the price had reached 233 billion marks.
1923 was a terrible year for Germany. Much of it was taken up by a terrible bout with hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of millions of Germans, particularly the German middle class. There were a number of radical left-wing uprisings in parts of Germany that were violent and were violently suppressed by the military and by local German governments.
By now, Hitler was making up to 6 speeches a day.
So as we get toward the end of 1923, Hitler begins to see an opportunity to stage a coup d'etat against the Bavarian state government, and one that he thought would spread and topple the government in Berlin.
On November 9th, Hitler led 3,000 of his supporters through the streets of Munich.
The idea was, in a sense, to emulate what Mussolini had done in Italy the year before with his famous, although not so accurately described, March on Rome. The plot failed dismally because, in fact, Hitler learned the hard way that he couldn't count on the local politicians in Munich and Bavaria.
Their way was blocked by police. Shots were fired. 21 people were killed, and Adolf Hitler's revolution ended as quickly as it had begun.
Hitler escaped and was arrested a couple of days later, and then famously put on trial along with some of the other major figures of this coup attempt. Many historians say the trial is the thing that really made Hitler a national figure in the minds of Germans outside of Bavaria.
As early as 1923, Hitler was stepping into the shoes he was destined to fill. The mighty Lenin died in the winter of 1924, and figures shuffled impatiently, ready to step into the light. Most of them had party names which they had taken to confuse the Tsarist secret police. Vladimir Ulanov became Lenin. Lev Bronstein became Trotsky, the name in a passport he stole in order to escape from internment. And Yosef Zhugashvili became Stalin, which means man of steel.
Stalin was general secretary of the party, and the advantage that being general secretary conferred to Stalin was the fact that Stalin developed a relationship with all these people in provincial committees in particular, who relied on him to deal with their pressing problems. Those relationships were very important when it came to, do we vote for Stalin at the next party congress or do we vote for Trotsky?
In 1924, Trotsky wrote, "He is needed by all of them, all the sneaks that are crawling out of the upturned soil of the revolution. Stalin will become the dictator of the USSR." In the 1925 German presidential election, Ludendorff stood on the Nazi ticket.
Ludendorff was very concerned with preparing Germany for another war that it could win. And Ludendorff thought that to do that, there would have to be an effective dictatorship that could crush all internal opposition and propagandize people effectively so that people would fight and sacrifice for it. This became the Nazi concept of the national community, or the Volksgemeinschaft.
Ludendorff received 1.1% of the vote. But it cannot have calmed nerves that the German people elected as their president a man who was both literally and figuratively a towering exemplar of Prussian militarism, and the emblem of the stolen victory of the First World War, Paul von Hindenburg.
Deutschland, hurra! Hurra! Hurra!
For many looking backwards at history, the high water mark for peacemaking came in 1925 at Locarno.
The Treaty of Locarno is celebrated by the British Foreign Secretary Austen Chamberlain as the real peace after the First World War. And by this, Chamberlain meant that Locarno had brought together the erstwhile enemies around the negotiating table.
The terms of the crucial Franco-German détente, spelled out in the treaty, had been agreed by the foreign ministers, Briand of France, Stresemann of Germany, and Austen Chamberlain of Great Britain during a 5-hour cruise across Lake Maggiore aboard the Orange Blossom. Locarno passed in the Reichstag against strong right-wing opposition. It legislated Germany's entry into the League of Nations, which owed a debt to Aristide Briand and Sir Austen Chamberlain. In Asia, instability was feeding change. China, a fractured country dominated by regional warlords, was no stranger to uncertainty. In July 1926, the Chinese Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, launched a military campaign with the aim to unite the country under one government. The expedition was carried out under the command of Chiang Kai-shek.
Chiang Kai-shek's aims as a leader was to not just unite China, but to make China a strong, powerful nation. China in the 19th century has suffered from a condition called semi-colonialism, in which pieces of its territories and some of its kind of national railways and resources are controlled by Westerners.
He's moving north and gradually winning battle after battle over these warlords. And in the process, also sort of serving notice to the imperialists that unless they start to work with him and be more cooperative and negotiate back some of these rights and interests that have been given away, he's going to turn his attention on them as well.
It wasn't just Western powers that stood to lose control of possessions within a unified China.
Japan's sphere of influence is up in the north, in northeastern Manchuria, and so they're getting more and more nervous about what this northern expedition is going to mean for themselves.
In Russia, 1927 saw Stalin ratify his grip on power at the 15th Party Congress and launched the first 5-year plan. It demanded a 110% increase in coal production, 200% in iron production, and 335% in electric power.
In the Soviet Union, looking back on the experience of its Tsarist predecessor in the First World War, the Soviets realized they had to prepare for total war. So that was one of the thinking behind the 5-year plans that Stalin launched in the 1920s.
Stalin told the party Congress that the economic plans were instructions which are compulsory.
Underlying the whole thing, actually, is a conflict between Stalin and Trotsky, because it's Stalin and the Politburo majority who are trying to make NEP work, and it's Trotsky behind the scenes who is saying this return to this quasi-capitalism is not where we want to go.
Both Trotsky and Zinoviev, his main supporter, were expelled from the party. The disasters of collectivization followed. In 5 years of giddy greed, from Locarno to the crash, about 30 billion marks was poured into Germany. Much from the USA, often pressed on local bureaucrats who did not want it, to spend on things their municipalities did not need. In this way, Germany received from overseas 3 times the amount she paid out as reparations. Had the crisis passed? Was this then peace?
Peace of the interwar period could definitely have lasted. By the mid-1920s, European governments had established a framework of relations that allowed them to build confidence between each other, and also to collaborate and negotiate the significant outstanding differences that remained, but to do so peacefully. And so it's really during the period between 1929 and 1933 that this framework is unpicked and then completely undone.
The reality was that by 1928, democracy had ebbed away from Italy, Spain, Portugal, Hungary, Austria, Yugoslavia, Poland and Lithuania. It had never been established in the Soviet Union, was limited in Japan, and unknown in China. After the success of the Northern Expedition, Chiang Kai-shek was looking to solidify his claim as leader of the Chinese Nationalist Party.
He was able to outmaneuver a lot of his rivals, such as Wang Jingwei, who was meant to be the true successor to the founder of the Kuomintang, Sun Yat-sen. And the way he did this was to be able to kind of play factions within his party off each other. And in doing so, he was able to emerge as the preeminent individual within the Chinese Nationalist Party.
In March, Chiang ordered the communist militia in his army disarmed. In April, he launched his anti-communist purge.
But because the Kuomintang was fearful of what was happening to their revolution, they turned on the communists. So this drew the Chinese communists into the countryside, and therefore starting a civil war.
There were 60,000 members of the Communist Party of China. By the end, no more than 10,000. And hundreds of thousands of peasants were killed in what became known as the White Terror. In the United States, President Calvin Coolidge told Congress, "The country can regard the present with satisfaction and anticipate the future with optimism." It was a farewell message. Herbert Hoover enjoyed a record-breaking victory in the November election, carrying 40 of the 48 states.
Well, when Herbert Hoover was elected president of the United States in 1928, he was arguably regarded as maybe the most highly respected personality on the world historical stage, not only in the United States.
Hoover's victory would be easily surpassed by his record-breaking defeat 4 years later, when Time magazine dubbed him President Reject. Why? One of the most catastrophic events of the 20th century was on the horizon. And though the Jazz Age was still in full swing, all bubbles burst in the end. On October 3rd, Gustav Stresemann, the architect of Germany's return to the top table, sat on the side of his bed, had a stroke, and died. In its obituary, the Times said of Stresemann that, because of his leadership, Germany is now prospering and has an important place in the affairs of Europe. But Stresemann knew better. Just before his death, he said, "The German economy is doing well only on the surface. Germany is in fact dancing on a volcano." If the short-term loans are called in by America, most of our economy will collapse. And that is what America did, and that is what happened. At the end of Black Tuesday, October 29th, Wall Street's paper losses totaled $10 billion, more than the national debt and twice the amount of money in circulation. Herbert Hoover said, "The trouble with capitalism is capitalists. They're too damn greedy."